Well, we've traveled quite a bit, I think, in the sessions we've had. We began way back at the beginning of January, looking at Empire is Born, the Akkadian Empire, very first one. Then living in the shadow of empire, and we looked at the story of the Jews from Egypt to Rome. Europe rules the world was our third theme, modern imperial domination. We were talking here about a history of 500 years, really. Then the British Empire, global power and imperial angst. We spent one night looking at Ireland and the British Empire, and then looked at the European Christian slave trade from 1441 to 1888, over owning institutionalized racism and white supremacy. And then the last evening, living with imperial legacies. And we turn on this last evening to look at religion and empire. And empires have always had their own theologies, if you like, and the Western empires, certainly the European empires, had the backing of Christianity. The sociologist Michael Mann has outlined 4 types of social power, and they are military power, that's the monopoly or control of force and violence. Economic power, the monopoly or control of labor and production. Political power, the monopoly or control of organization and institution. And the 4th type is ideological power, the monopoly or control of interpretation and meaning. Now, put them together, and perhaps that's the model of imperial power and how it works as a kind of totalism. And we can think of the Roman Empire being very much like that. Rome's imperial theology was the ideological power that provided a kind of transcendental legitimation and mandate to rule absolutely. Rome, it was said, announced world conquest, global rule, and eternal sovereignty. Augustus was on the side of divinity. Well, for the Chinese, it was the mandate of heaven, a transcendental claim. The British Empire would claim for God and empire. Kaiser Wilhelm for God and fatherland. It's what empires do. The military, economic, and political power is total and is so all-powerful that it is oppressive and unjust in what it does to the colonized. But the empire's ideological power is also total, dominating and controlling thought and emotions, determining truth and meaning, and the only authorized or interpretative principle by which meaning is allowed. Empire is not only the colonizing of bodies, but also of minds, ensuring more than one form, if you like, of slavery. When we come to look at religion, and we want to look especially at Judaism and Christianity, Judaism was born in resistance to empire. It's a religion of resistance to empire, and much of that resistance in its history was the resistance of ideological power. It came into being as a resistance movement to empire, and its sacred text has a succession of empires as the foreground, and we explored that in the second session. The succession of superpowers and empires was broken twice, first by the modest empire of King Solomon, and then a century plus of independence by the people we know as the Maccabees. The empire that Solomon built had the recurring markers of ancient and modern empires. Solomon's economy was an extraction economy, taking wealth from the vulnerable and putting it in the hands of a very powerful elite. Not surprisingly, there was eventually a taxation revolt as the vulnerable and exploited resisted the empire. Solomon created a free trading empire where everything and everyone was a commodity. People and goods were possessed and consumed as forced labor became the imperial policy, as did ever expansive trade policies and limitless wealth. Now, if the extraction economy and policies of forced labor and commodification were to succeed and grow, Solomon needed a large military force. Expansive imperial wealth needed an army, not on standby, but on full operational alert. And with all of this, Solomon created the ideological myths to legitimate and support his political, economic, and military modes of imperial power. He built an enormous temple, dedicated with much myth-making, imperial liturgy, and prayer. Now the power of God was aligned with the power of the empire. And the God of the temple liturgy was the supporter of the policies of extraction and commodification. The power of the rituals, the enacted myths, and the splendid liturgy were the ideological power that held the empire in place and provided social order. And Solomon, too, was on the side of divinity. So such was the pervasive and dominant imperial narrative until, and this is part of the biblical narrative, until it was resisted by a remarkable group of people known in the Hebrew tradition as prophets. Theirs was a critical and alternative narrative, a subversive ideology that stood over against the mythic claims of imperial religion. And in the face of every empire, as well as Solomon's, there was a counter text subverting the dominant imperial text. Empire is always resisted by, perhaps amongst other things, but certainly by ideological power, an undermining narrative, indeed a narrative centered on an alternative God to the God of empire. Now, ancient Israel's alternative and paradigmatic narrative is the Exodus from Egyptian slavery to liberation and to freedom. It is one of two controlling narratives resisting extractive and oppressive economies, never-ending production line, Pharaoh's never-ending production line and brickworks, his mythic identity as a god. And the Exodus narrative is centered on the alternative myth of a liberating God who is active in the service of emancipation and the end of economic extraction and commodification. And the narrative is not a once upon a time story, but a paradigm of resistance and liberation. The narrative begins with the cries of the slaves in suffering in Pharaoh's brickworks. There is no longer silence, but articulated suffering and pain made public. History is what hurts, and the hurt of Egyptian slavery at the hands of Egyptian imperialism was voiced, and the voice of historical hurt was heard by the alternative God to the God of empire. And the myth of the God of imperial economic extraction, oppressive political power, and military and violent might was subverted by the alternative myth of a God who is with the hurt of history and with a purpose of liberation and freedom. So human agency is empowered by the vision of alternative purpose and confronts Pharaoh with, "Let my people go." And the human agency is embodied in the narrative by Moses, the liberator, not alone, but as the lead figure in a community empowered for resistance and a liberation struggle. The empire, of course, resists the resistance, and an immense liberation struggle takes place. Pharaoh will not let the slaves go, not without a brutal and violent assault. And even as the slaves come out of empire, they are pursued by military might. But in the end, Pharaoh's army is bogged down, marred in its own violence and brutality. That narrative has been played out many times in history, and it offers a paradigm, if you like, of liberating power. Empire is resisted, and empire rarely, if ever, lets its colonized and enslaved peoples go free. Someone has put it this way: in fact, decolonization of India, Kenya, Malaysia, Cyprus, Egypt, Palestine, and many other colonies entailed horrendous violence, none of which has been formally memorialized or regretted, unlike other modern crimes against humanity, such as the Holocaust and Hiroshima. Public memory is hostage to myth, and worse still, to amnesia. And in the Jewish memory, this paradigm narrative, memory is kept alive in the reenactment of the alternative myth with its alternative God of liberation, and is a narrative passionately against extraction, commoditization, and empire. And in this narrative, resistance to empire is what is understood as faith or faithfulness. Now, the other controlling narrative in the Jewish tradition is the exile in Babylon. This experience shaped Jewish identity and created Judaism. The experience was traumatic, shattering everything about the community, including all its symbols of meaning. Everything was shattered, including the community's essential faith and values. Yet exile brought out the most amazing creativity. An exiled community reimagined the sacred, reimagined who they were as a community and what in the world they were for. And confronted and dominated by the ideological power of the Babylonian imperial myth, they crafted an alternative myth, an alternative counter-imperial narrative, and an alternative God narrative. As an exiled community, they came out of empire before they began the journey back to a homeland. With subversive ideological power, they departed empire, if you like, before the Babylonian Empire was replaced by the Persian Empire, and the Edict of Cyrus proclaimed their freedom from exile and set them free to return home. That return from Babylonian exile was understood as a new exodus. The old paradigm played out again in real history. And Babylon also became the symbol for all subsequent imperial experience. And when John of Patmos, the author of that rather strange writing in the 1st century CE Christian tradition, the Book of Revelation, a piece of resistance literature to the Roman Empire, there Babylon became the code language that was used. Rome was coded as Babylon, as theology and faith resisted and came out of empire around the end of the 1st century. It was in 597 BCE that the Hebrew people first felt the power of the Babylonian Empire, and a first group of people were transported to Babylon. By 550, various resistance movements were attacking the Babylonian Empire, eventually leading to its collapse and succession by the growing and emerging empire of Persia. Persia we now know as Iran, and the Persian Empire stretched from Greece to India and was larger than the Babylonian Empire and any empire up to that time. It lasted from 539 to 333 BCE, when it was succeeded by Alexander the Great and his Greek Empire. The Persians liberated exiled peoples from Babylonian captivity and even sponsored the return home, and also the massive rebuilding program that was required to reconstruct the community, its infrastructure around Jerusalem. Persia invested much in personnel and monetary grants to rebuild a city and its symbols of meaning, such as a temple. But as with all empires, there was no free lunch. Freedom and huge financial support came with conditions and agreements. Community might be restored, but under Persian control and conditions. And it is this experience of empire and the narrative that emerged from this time that provides a paradigm of accommodation and resistance to empire. Community could not be constructed without Persian support. And Persia still intended to regulate life and culture in the Jewish colonized region, as well as elsewhere in the empire. The empire allowed and supported the practice of temple liturgy and religious tradition, but the empire intended the religious practices to support the empire completely. And yet the narrative of this community was in tension with the imperial power. Religion in support of the empire, having to find ways of living with the empire and within the empire, accommodating itself to the empire's expressions of power and control, including its ideological power. Now, the strength and power of empire in human history are immense and seemingly irresistible. Empires develop by conquest and grow and continue through control, which is often largely military control. Colonized peoples have to find ways of living with empire, which often means coming to terms with empire, and a people accommodating themselves to the imperial presence and control and even oppression. Some work for the empire and are beneficiaries of it. Others live with deep ambivalence, living with it. How did the Vietnamese live with the French Empire, or the Indonesians with the Dutch, or the peoples of India with the British? The Irish lived within the British Empire with much ambivalence, and during the Home Rule crisis and partition, they divided in their stances, and each with arms to determine their futures came out or stayed in. Imperialization is a powerful force, but it always breeds and produces resistance. It did with the Persian Empire. Accommodation and resistance occurred immediately, simultaneously. And in the Hebrew biblical narrative, the third part of the book called Isaiah, known as Third Isaiah, reflects the deep tensions in the period of return to a homeland. In Isaiah 56 to 66, we hear different voices. We hear voices supporting the Persian-sponsored temple, and we hear voices opposing it. There are contested voices, those accommodating to imperial presence and those resisting. They even understood God differently and interpreted the liturgy differently, some pro-imperial, some indifferent, others anti-imperial. But resistance to imperialization shaped their sacred writings. Books like Job and Ecclesiastes expressed a profound intellectual tradition that involved deep questioning and skepticism towards settled truths, certainties, and accepted cultural norms of empire. These were writings of resistance, dissent, and protest. Genesis 1, totally distorted as a battlefield between science and religion, was in fact a profound anti-imperial myth, a counter-imperial assertion in the face of the Babylonian and Persian empires. That, I think, is the Hebrew Bible. We hear it read in liturgies week in, week out, but do we really know where it's coming from and what it's resisting and what it's trying to say? Loretto, we'll go into groups and throw those questions around maybe. There are a couple of questions that might be useful to follow in groups. Going back to that Exodus myth, a paradigm narrative for liberation and freedom from slavery and empire. Think of ways in which the paradigm has played itself out in history. And then the awkward question, I suppose, how do we live with the ambivalence between accommodation and resistance to empires? How do we accommodate? How do we resist? We'll have 20 minutes of lively discussion, I'm sure, and then we'll come back and share a more open conversation. Okay, thank you. Let's move, take a last look at, we looked at Judaism and its resistance to empire. Christian roots, of course, are in the Jewish tradition. Behind the Christianity of Christendom, of which we've been a part, is a faith and a Jesus movement, which is essentially Jewish. Now, Jesus had a purpose, and at its heart, there seems to have been a core metaphor. It was his life's passion, and it was the kingdom or the reign of God. The Greek word used is basileia, and that, in fact, is the word for empire.
All right.
From the moment when Christianity became aligned with empire around 313 CE, it then spiritualized basileia, internalizing it, or turning the kingdom of God or heaven into some other worldly goal for life. It became a matter of life after death. Well, empires were in full support of such theology. That suited an empire. But Jesus was not concerned with life after death, but with life before death. Life in this world of empire and imperialism. Now, a rabbi, which he was, who kept talking to people about the empire of God in a world dominated and controlled by the empire of Caesar, was always going to be heard as subversive. And for those peasants of Roman-occupied Galilee, this rabbi was always going to be heard as pointing to an alternative empire. And they would not have missed, I think, the theology of resistance. And in the Jewish tradition to which it belonged, basileia was both a political and a spiritual metaphor. The false dualism did not exist. The very term basileia of God combined the political basileia and the theological God. So living in the Roman Empire under its political, economic, military, and ideological or theological modes of power, pointing by word and deed to the empire of God, was resistant and it was subversive. And at the end of his life, when the ultimate confrontation came between Jesus and the empire's representative, Pilate, John's gospel has Jesus say, "My kingdom is not of this world." Now, this does not mean something otherworldly, but an alternative empire here and now. Furthermore, if it were of this world, of the empire Pilate represents, Jesus' friends would come armed and with violence strike against the empire. The basileia of God has a different value base, an actively non-violent empire. So the ideological power of the Roman Empire is resisted by the ideological power of the non-violent empire of God. And this is a very different programmatic theology to the Roman imperial programmatic theology or any imperial programmatic theology. So Jesus was being quite subversive in the core metaphor that was central to his teaching and his practice. Then when we go to Paul, Paul, like Jesus, is also rooted in the Jewish tradition of resistance to empire. Now, Paul has been described as appealing or appalling. And the appalling Paul has been accused of being pro-slavery, anti-Semitic, misogynist, and homophobic. Now, there are critical, historical, and contextual issues to be considered when reading Paul, especially when reading the modern Enlightenment and Reformation construction of Paul. The Jewish Paul, moving around an urban Roman imperial world, is something else. Pauline, he wrote letters probably hundreds maybe, but only 7 authentically Pauline letters remain. And the greatest of his letters, regarded as the most theological of his letters, was written to a faith community living and struggling at the very heart of the empire in Rome itself. And the letter to the Romans has been read as through the lens of the 16th century Reformation's polemic, now recognized, I think, as a serious distortion of Paul. And on this reading, though, Paul is anti-Jewish and totally resistant to the Jewish tradition. Now, this is rather strange for someone who writes so much of his letters in Jewish thought forms and categories, and historical context is important. And when Paul is placed in the context of Imperial Rome, and attention is given not only to his Jewish thought forms, but also his frequent, very frequent use of Roman imperial vocabulary, then we encounter someone consistent with his Jewish tradition, and for whom faith is resistance to the empire. Paul lived in the world of the divine Caesar, whose being on the side of divinity gave the emperor absolute authority and the right to total obedience and loyalty from the populace. This is the great leader who brought peace to the world through victory, domination, and conquest. And this imperial peace was described by the empire as good news and was to be believed by all people who gave their ultimate loyalty and faithful commitment to the emperor and to the empire. In the world of the peace of Rome and Augustus, Paul spoke from a different ideological mode of power, an alternative good news, a counter-narrative. And the imperial vision of peace was peace through victory and conquest. For Paul, the alternative vision was of peace through justice. And this was the heart of what Paul wrote to the faith community at the heart of the empire. In Romans, Paul is on fire with the justice of God. Romans is a letter in which justice as the way to peace and right and restored relationships is Paul's program of action in Rome, in Philippi, in Corinth, and wherever else in the imperial world where he lived and traveled so extensively. Paul in Romans is not anti-Jewish, but he is strongly anti-Roman. And his central theology of justice is in resistance to the empire. The empire operated through its program of political, economic, military, and ideological domination to the benefit of an elite with increasing wealth and power. Paul had no political, economic, or military power, but he did have an alternative ideological power, an alternative divine myth, if you like, or narrative that resisted and subverted the empire. For Paul, justice as the only basis for peace was the justice of equality. It was social and relational justice, or a vision of equality as justice, or justice as equality. And in one of his other influential letters, Galatians, the justice as equality is not spiritualized, but concrete and embodied. Ethnic identity, social status or standing, and gender status are abolished in a vision of community. The basileia, or empire of God, is a radically equal and just alternative. Faith for Paul the Jew was resistance to empire through a vision of justice as equality as the way to peace. Now, I'm not going to go into the last book of the Bible, but it is a book with all its weird and bizarre imagery. It is a book of resistance to empire at the end of the 1st century, or the beginning just of the 2nd century. But leave that for the moment. Theology, we need to face up to it, certainly in the West, has supported and legitimized empires in history, especially Christian theology in European history. And empires have instrumentalized God in the service of the empire. Vladimir Putin, by the way, has just done the same thing. 2 weeks ago, he was in a speech quoting the Bible, not once, but twice. People have worshipped the imperialist God and given themselves in the service of the empire, even in ordering acts of brutal violence against those considered a threat to the empire or rising for independence. You remember from earlier sessions, a good Tipperary Catholic gave the orders at Amritsar in 1919, and a good Belfast Protestant negotiated the ports and the extensive trading access for opium in the Opium Wars of the mid-19th century China. Others have had a different vision of God, a different experience of liturgy and worship, and resisted the empire. For many, it was and is a struggle to navigate the difficult terrain between accommodation with empire and resistance to it. And that Jewish-Persian paradigm of accommodation resistance is all too true to life experience in empire and even in living with imperial legacies. Accommodation can often be a strategy for survival, especially when there is no political, economic, and military power to counter the empire. To survive is often to reach accommodation with empire. Laos is a small Southeast Asian country of 7 million people. It got its independence from the French Empire in 1954, but has never really been independent and free. Its people have experienced violence and domination, and now Laos lives with the increasing reach and rising power of China, its next door neighbor. It cannot escape or avoid the economic reach of China and the thousands of Chinese who are moving into Laos as part of China's economic and imperial expansion. And the Chinese stay in Laos and they build businesses, but what becomes of the identity of the people of Laos? A Laotian prince whose monarchy was abolished in 1975, reflected on his country's turbulent history and predicted that, quote, after centuries of foreign intrusions, Laos and its people would find a way to navigate China's ascent. He said, we saw the eagle come from the US during the Vietnam War. We had the bear from Moscow. We had the dragon from Vietnam. We had the white elephant from Siam, and we also had the French colonials. Adaptation is our politics. Well, the people of Laos have adapted and found accommodation with successive imperial powers. A small nation perhaps has had little option, yet beneath the adaptation and accommodation, there is resistance. And the accommodation itself is defiant and resistant, refusing, albeit if sullenly, to accept or totally surrender to the empire. The French, the Americans, the Russians, the Thais, and now the Chinese will never be fully accepted, and the longing for independence and freedom will not die. Christian theology has not only supported empire, it has also resisted it. The Jewish narrative is of resistance to empire. Christianity, when it's true to its Jewish roots, is also in resistance to empire. Empire itself is only too happy with otherworldly faith, life after death. It's happy also with narcoticizing liturgy and with religion as soul salvation. All of this in support of empire, and is not only uncritical of empire, but faith is faith in empire. Better still, to the empire, I suppose, when faith explicitly buys into empire and gives the empire theological blessing and legitimation and support. And in Christianity, as with all the people of the book, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, Faith is not in the book, but in resistance to empire and to domination system. The book has the resources for resistance to empire. The Bible, well, it seems to be a book of literature shaped and arranged in resistance to empire, and perhaps can only be read as against empire. And so faith is faithful resistance, or it may not be faith. Okay, we can have a conversation. The Bible is a book of resistance to empire. Is that how we've read the church's foundational document?